In this video, we will learn about least common denominators, and this will be in the context of algebra. Now, to understand how to do this with algebra, we need to understand how to do this with actual numbers. So a little review with real numbers. If we had 3 over 8 equals something over 32, and we're trying to determine what would our numerator be. So we're asking how would we write this as something over 32. Well, what I do is I look at the denominator and see how are we getting from 8 to 32. Well, we are multiplying by 4, right? 8 times 4 is 32. So do the same thing on the top. Multiply the top by 4 as well. So 3 times 4 would give me 12. So that is my numerator. Now that's the basic concept that will carry us through even with the algebra problems. Here we see another example where now we have variables. We have 6 over 5x equals something over 25x to the third power. So we ask ourselves once again, what are we multiplying 5x by to get to 25x to the third power? Well, 5 times 5 gives me 25, and x times x squared gives me x to the third power. So this would be multiplied by 5 and an x squared. So I do the same thing on the top as well. I do 6 times 5x squared. So 6 times 5x squared would equal 30x squared for the top, and then your bottom was 25x to the third power. Now example 3, we're going to increase the difficulty one more time, where we have 4 over x plus 2 equals something over x plus 2 times x minus 3. So here we're trying to figure out what is our numerator. Well, to determine that, we look at the denominators. So we ask ourselves, what are we multiplying x plus 2 by to get to this new denominator? Well, what's different? Well, we're multiplying by an x minus 3 on the bottom. So therefore, I multiply the top by an x minus 3 as well. So I take that 4 and multiply by an x minus 3. And that's going to be my numerator, 4 times x minus 3. And at this point, there's no need to distribute or anything. We're just trying to determine what will go on the top. So now the question is, how do we know what we want our denominators to be? Like, how do we know it's supposed to be x plus 2 times x minus 3? Well, the whole purpose of changing the denominator is for addition and subtraction of fractions. So in this lesson, we're just dealing with how to convert into a new fraction, and in later lessons, you will learn how to use those to then add or subtract. So to figure out what our denominator needs to be, we will be looking at all of the fractions that we are dealing with, and we will look at their denominators. And we're going to find what is the least common denominator, and then convert everything into that new denominator. So a little review with finding the least common denominator. We're going to begin with how to do this with just regular numbers. So to do this, we need to factor each denominator completely, and then find the product of the greatest power of each factor in the denominators. For example, if we had 5 over 24, 8 over 27, and 7 over 30, we need to determine the least common denominator by looking at the 24, 27, and 30. So we find the least common multiple of 24, 27, and 30. And to do that, we need to factor down each of those numbers. So we can do the factoring tree thing, where we do 24, break that down, we get 3 times 8. 8 would be 2 times 4, then 4 would be 2 times 2. So we have 3 times 2 to the third power, all right, or 2 to the third times 3. We do that for each of the numbers, 27 and 30 as well. 27 would be 3 to the third power, and 30 would be 2 times 3 times 5. So after you factor down every denominator, I look to see which factors we have represented. Well, we have 2's, we have 3's, and we have 5's, right? 2's, 3's, and 5's. And the question is, how many of each are we going to take? Well, we take whichever one has the greatest power of each. So for example, the 2's, we see the most 2's are here with the 24. So that's 3 of them, so we take 3 2's, so 2 to the third power. Looking at the 3's, we see 27 has the most 3's with 3 of them, so that would be 3 to the third power. And then the 5's, we have the most here with the 30, which is 1 of them, so we take 1 5. And then the least common denominator you can find by multiplying the 2 to the third times 3 to the third times 5, which will equal 1080. So this is how you find the least common denominator with just regular numbers. But the concept is exactly the same with variables and variable expressions. So here we see 5 over 8x minus 32 and 6 over 5x minus 20. So like we said in the last example, we need to factor down the denominators. In this case, it's not just a number, we have a variable expression. So 8x minus 32, I can factor that down by factoring out an 8. So we factor an 8 out, and in parentheses, we have x minus 4. Right? And if you forget how to do this, go back and check some previous videos on how to factor by pulling out the greatest common factor. So here we have factored 8x minus 32. And then we have 5x minus 20. And actually, before we do that, notice the 8 can factor down right here. I'm going to factor everything, even the numbers in the front. So 8 can factor to be 2 to the third power. So now looking at the 5x minus 20, notice they both have a 5 in common. So I can factor a 5 out, and I'm left with x minus 4 in parentheses. Alright, so we have 5 times x minus 4. So now from here, now that we've factored, we need to see how many of each of the factors do we take. So notice we have 2's, we have 5's, and we have x minus 4's, which is one quantity. So looking at the 2's, we see which one has the most 2's, and we see that the first one has the most with 3 of them. So we take all 3 of those 2's. And then looking at the 5's, down here the second one has the most 5's. So we take 1 5 because the most we have is 1. And then x minus 4's is a tie. They both have 1, so I just take one of them. So I have 1 x minus 4. So the least common denominator is found by multiplying the 2 to the third times 5 times x minus 4. And 2 to the third is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. And 8 times 5 is 40. So my least common denominator is 40 times x minus 4. So now we're going to put everything together. So we know how to convert fractions with a new denominator, and we know now how to find the least common denominator. So putting that all together, we are going to rewrite these two fractions with their least common denominator. So to begin with, we must determine what is the least common denominator. So we look at the two denominators, and we begin by factoring everything down. So x squared minus 4x plus 4, assuming we know how to factor, we would get x minus 2 times x minus 2. X squared minus 10x plus 16, that can factor, and assuming we know how to factor that, we would get 8x minus 2 times x minus 8. So from here, now that we've factored, we can determine the least common denominator by looking at the factors that we have represented. We have x minus 2's, and we have x minus 8's. So the question is, how many of each do we take? Well, looking at x minus 2's, the one with the most would be right here, with 2 of them. So we take 2 x minus 2's, or x minus 2 squared. And then looking at the x minus 8's, this one has the most with 1, so we take 1 x minus 8. Put it all together to find the least common denominator. We will have x minus 2 squared times x minus 8. Now, no need to multiply everything out because this will make it easier to leave it like this as you convert the fractions. So looking at this first fraction right here, we have 8 over x squared minus 4x plus 4. Now the bottom we can factor down, as we've already done, to be x minus 2 times x minus 2, or x minus 2 squared. Now to convert this into a fraction with this new least common denominator, we know we need something over x minus 8, right? Or sorry, something over x minus 2 squared times x minus 8. So what is changing from the original fraction to the new fraction is the x minus 8. So I'm multiplying the bottom by x minus 8, which means I need to multiply the top by x minus 8 as well. Alright, so my new fraction would be 8 times x minus 8 over x minus 2 squared times x minus 8. And that is what I see typed up right here. Now looking at the other fraction, 4 over x squared minus 10x plus 16, we've already factored the denominator right here to be x minus 2 times x minus 8. So when I rewrite this as a new fraction with this least common denominator, the denominator needs to be x minus 2 squared times x minus 8. So the question is, what am I multiplying the original fraction by to get to this new denominator? Well, what is changing? We started with 1x minus 2. Now we have 2x minus 2's. So that means I had to multiply by an x minus 2. So I do the same thing to the top. I take the 4 and multiply by x minus 2 as well. So my second fraction would look like this. 4 times x minus 2 over x minus 2 squared times x minus 8. Now in future lessons, we will learn how to take these different fractions and learn how to add and subtract them. But for today, this concludes our lesson, and we will see you next time.